For she had been told her whole life that men were cruel, that a husband was nothing more than a master with a ring, that marriage meant shackles instead of love. And as the train hissed and steamed across the endless prairie, toward the dusty station where her fate awaited, her heart beat like a trapped bird, frantic, desperate, searching for a crack in the cage to fly free. But there was no escape, because her father had signed the papers, had bartered her future to a man she'd never seen, and the whispering voices of women around her had only deepened her dread. Cowboys are rough, cowboys are cold. Cowboys only want land, work, and someone to command, they had said. And so she sat stiff-backed on the worn wooden bench of the rattling car, clutching her small carpet bag, staring out at the wide horizon that stretched into forever, a land both terrifying and breathtaking, where freedom seemed close enough to touch but responsibility dragged her back to her duty, until at last the whistle blew long and shrill. The train slowed with the groan of brakes, and she saw the small station come into view. A few weathered buildings, a scattering of horses tied along a fence, dust swirling in the golden light of evening, and waiting on the platform stood a tall man with a broad-brimmed hat tipped low against the sun, boots planted firm, shoulders wide from years of hard labor, a cowboy through and through, and her stomach twisted with fear that this was him, the stranger who would hold the papers that bound her life. She almost faltered, almost stayed in her seat, and prayed the train would carry her further west to nowhere at all. But the conductor called her stop, and there was no choice, so she rose on trembling legs, clutched her bag to her chest, and stepped down onto the platform, eyes darting to the stranger whose gaze found hers in an instant, steady and unreadable. And when he took off his hat, revealing eyes the color of stormy skies and a smile that was warm instead of harsh, gentle instead of commanding, something inside her cracked open just a little, like the first ray of sun after a storm, though she still kept her guard high. He walked to her, boots crunching softly against the boards, and in a voice rich and calm he said, "You must be Clara. I'm James, your husband." The word made her breath catch, but before she could stiffen, he reached for her bag not to snatch it but to carry it, and when he saw the fear flicker in her eyes, he lifted his hand in quiet promise and said softly, "I'll be kind." 3 words, spoken with a sincerity that wrapped around her heart tighter than chains, not because they trapped but because they freed. And suddenly her dread loosened its grip, leaving only a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this life would not be the cage she imagined. He helped her down, guided her toward his horse-drawn wagon, speaking not of commands or demands but asking simple things. Was your journey long? Are you hungry? Would you, 2 and a 3, like to rest before we head out to the ranch? Each question was gentle, as if he had no desire to force but only to understand, and she found herself answering in small, cautious words, watching him, waiting for the mask to fall, for the cruelty she'd been told to expect to reveal itself. But it never did, not on that ride across the rolling plains, not when he pointed out the distant line of mountains glowing, purple in the setting sun, not when he pulled a blanket from behind the seat and tucked it around her, shoulders against the cool wind. By the time they reached his ranch, where the homestead sat sturdy and strong beneath a sky full of stars, her hands had stopped trembling, though her heart still held doubt. That first night he did not demand her presence, did not press his rights as a husband, but instead made up a small meal of stew and bread, letting her eat in silence, only speaking when she seemed comfortable enough to ask a question. When he showed her the house, he gestured toward a room prepared just for her, with a quilt laid neatly on the bed and a vase of fresh-picked wildflowers on the table, and he said, "I thought you might like a space to call your own until you feel ready to share more." And her eyes stung with tears she did, not let fall, because never in her life had anyone given her choice. Not her father, not the world. And here was this cowboy, this supposed hard man of the frontier, giving her the one thing she had prayed for, kindness. Days turned into weeks, and she watched him work the land, rise with the sun, labor with sweat and strength, yet always come back to her with a smile, never harsh, never demanding, and she found herself drawn to the steadiness of his presence, the way he spoke to the horses as if they were friends, the way he tipped his hat to every woman in town with respect, the way he looked at her not as property but as a partner. Slowly, walls she had built for survival began to crumble, and laughter returned to her lips like a song she had forgotten. He taught her to ride, steadying her in the saddle with gentle hands, his touch never lingering too long, never taking without asking. And when she succeeded, when she galloped across the open field with the wind in her hair, she turned to see pride shining in his eyes. Not pride in ownership, but pride in her freedom. One evening, as the sun bled gold and crimson across the sky, she found him repairing a fence, sweat glistening on his brow, and she stood for a long moment watching, realizing that the cruel husband she feared had never arrived, that instead she had been given a man who knew the true strength of gentleness. When he saw her there, he wiped his hands, came to her with that same quiet smile, and said, "Clara, I don't want you to think of me as someone you're bound to by papers. I want to earn your trust, to earn your heart if you'll give me the chance." And in that moment, all the fear, all the shadows of warnings whispered in her past. Three melted into the earth beneath her feet, and she stepped closer, laid her trembling hand in his, and whispered, "You already have." From then on, their life together was not a cage but a horizon, wide and endless, filled with days of shared laughter, nights of tender conversation, dreams built together on the foundation of kindness, proving to her and to anyone who watched that love is not about chains or cruelty, but about choice, respect, and the courage to be gentle. So when strangers asked her if she had feared marrying a cowboy, she would only smile, glance toward James, who always tipped his hat with that same soft grin, and say, "I expected a cruel husband, but I found a kind man instead." And dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, if it made you believe again in love that heals instead of harms, in kindness that conquers fear, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because every story here carries a piece of hope, a reminder that no matter how dark the past may seem, there is always a chance for light, for freedom, and for a love that says not "you are mine, but I'll be kind." 1-3 The days on the ranch began to roll into each other like golden waves of wheat under the prairie sun. Yet for Clara, each one held new discoveries, new pieces of the life she was slowly learning to trust. And though she had feared the worst when stepping off that train, now she found herself waking each morning to the sound of roosters crowing, horses nickering in the barn, and James humming softly as he pulled on his boots, and the sound filled her with a quiet warmth she had never known in her father's house. Back then, mornings meant orders barked, expectations pressed heavy on her shoulders. But here mornings meant the beginning of choice, the unfolding of freedom, and though she still carried the ghosts of warnings that marriage was only a man's claim on a woman, James continued to prove each day that he was different, that his word "I'll be kind" had not been spoken as a trick but as a vow. Still, Clara's heart wrestled with its own battles, for trust did not come easily after years of fear, and sometimes in the silence of night when James slept in the other room by his own choice, she would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when the mask would fall, when the harshness she was told was inevitable would rise like a storm to wash away the fragile peace she had found. Yet every morning he greeted her with the same gentle smile, the same offer of coffee and fresh bread, the same question of what she wished to do with her day, and those simple acts chipped away at her doubt more than any grand gesture could. One morning he asked her if she would like to join him in mending fences, and though she had never worked with her hands in that way, she agreed, if only to prove to herself she was capable of sharing his world. And as the two of them walked across the pasture, tools in hand, he told her stories of the land, how he had come there as a young man with nothing but determination, how he had built each post and rail with sweat and grit, and yet his voice carried no arrogance, only gratitude for what the land had given back. She listened, her heart softening, realizing that kindness was not weakness but a strength deeper than cruelty could ever hold. At the fence line, he showed her patiently how to hammer nails, how to stretch the wire tight, his large hands guiding hers only when necessary, never lingering, never presuming. And when she finally drove a nail in straight and strong, he laughed with delight, clapping his hands together and saying, "See, Clara, you're tougher than you think." And her own laughter burst free like a bird taking flight, a sound so foreign to her ears that tears pricked her eyes, for she could not remember the last time she had laughed without fear of being silenced. Later that day, as the sun dropped lower and painted the sky in streaks of amber, James took her riding again, and this time he let her lead, watching proudly as she guided the horse with growing confidence, and when she urged it into a gallop, the wind whipped her hair back, carrying away the last of her chains, and she felt more alive than ever before, her heart racing not from dread but from joy. And when she slowed and looked back, James was smiling at her with an expression so tender she nearly forgot to breathe. In the evenings, they often sat together on the porch, listening to the crickets sing. And though he never pushed her, Clara found herself speaking more, sharing pieces of her past, the fears her father had planted, the warnings of women who told her men could not be trusted, and James listened without interruption, his jaw tightening only when she spoke of cruelty, but when she finished he always reached for her hand gently, holding it in silence, letting her know without words that her pain was safe with him, that he would not repeat the sins of others. One night, when thunder rolled across the plains and lightning split the sky, Clara trembled with old fears. For storms had always brought her father's temper crashing down like the rain, but James lit a lamp, sat by her side, and told her stories of how storms fed the land, how the rain gave life to crops and the thunder only echoed strength, and slowly she began to see the storm not as a threat but as a promise of renewal. And when she leaned against his shoulder, he simply wrapped his arm around her, steady and warm, no words, no demands, just presence, and that was enough to teach her that love could be quiet and safe. Time passed and Clara began to meet the neighbors, women in town who looked at her curiously, some whispering about how quickly she had married, others wondering aloud if she could handle ranch life, but she held her head high because James never let her face them alone, always introducing her as his partner, his equal, never once using the word wife as though it meant ownership, but always as though it meant pride. And those who watched saw the truth in his eyes and softened their judgments. The ranch grew busier with the changing seasons, planting and harvesting, branding and herding, and Clara found herself becoming part of the rhythm, no longer the outsider who had stepped off a train, but a woman who belonged, who could saddle a horse, mend a tear in a fence, cook a meal after long days of work, and laugh with her husband under the stars. And with each passing day her fear of cruelty faded, replaced by gratitude and a love she had once thought impossible. Yet there came a moment that tested them, when one evening a group of rough men stopped at the ranch asking for water and a place to rest, and though James welcomed them with hospitality, Clara saw the way their eyes lingered on her, heard the coarse words whispered under their breath, and old fear surged like a flood, but James stood tall, his voice calm yet unyielding as he told the men to show respect or leave. And when one reached too far with his words, James stepped between Clara and danger, his hand resting lightly on the revolver at furthering his hip, his eyes sharp as steel. And in that moment she saw the balance of who he was. Gentle, yes, but never weak, kind, yes, but never a man to let cruelty reign unchecked. And the men backed down, muttering as they left, leaving Clara shaken yet safe. That night she cried quietly, confessing to James her terror that one day she might still be trapped by a man's power, and he cupped her face in his calloused hands, his gaze steady as he said, "On Clara, I don't want power over you. I want power with you, together. That's the only way I'll ever love you." His words branded her heart, more deeply than any iron could mark cattle, and from that moment she no longer doubted his promise. Their bond grew stronger, their laughter louder, their silences more comfortable, until one evening as the sun dipped low, James finally asked her, not demanded, but asked, if she would like to move from her separate room into his, and with tears of joy and trust she said yes, not because papers bound them, but because love had chosen it. And as she lay in his arms that night, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she whispered, "You've given me more than kindness. You've given me freedom." And he kissed her forehead, whispering back, "And then you've given me home." To anyone who doubted, who still believed cowboys were cruel or marriage was a chain, Clara's story stood as proof that love could be gentle, that kindness could build a life stronger than fear. And as their days stretched into years, each morning began the same, with James smiling at her over coffee, saying without words the vow he had once spoken at the train, "I'll be kind." And dear viewers, if this chapter filled your heart with hope, if it reminded you that love can be safe and strong, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories waiting, stories of courage, freedom, and love that heals. And I promise each one will bring you closer to the belief that kindness always wins in the end.